Chapter 6. Pool. The boys' gymnasium was one of the oldest buildings on Cherub campus. It had recently been refurbished with the latest exercise machines and weight training equipment. A small extension had been built to provide changing rooms and showers for girls, and the derelict basement cinema where Cherubs had watched newsreels and movies in the 50s and 60s had been stripped out and turned into a lounge, complete with pool, snooker, and air hockey tables. Big screen TVs showed sports channels, there were oversized sofas, and the glass-fronted fridges and cupboards along one side of the room were stocked with snacks and soft drinks. The lounge had been completed less than a month earlier, and the novelty had yet to wear off. It was packed with Cherubs whenever it was open, and a rota restricted access to certain age groups to prevent overcrowding. Cherubs usually had lessons on Saturday morning, but the lounge had been specially opened for the 26 kids who'd returned from the aborted training exercise in the Yorkshire Dales. After making grave threats to a bunch of younger kids who'd been hogging one of the full-sized snooker tables for more than an hour, Lauren, Rat, Bethany and Andy managed to get a game. None of them was very good. Rat was the most naturally gifted player, but he'd spent the first 11 years of his life inside a religious cult and was struggling to master the rules. So I've knocked in the red. Now, what colour do I have to pot first? Lauren tutted. Whatever colour you nominate, for the third time. But I thought you had to do yellow, green, brown, or whatever, Rat said. That's only after all the reds have been potted at the end. Right, Rat said. Blue ball, corner pocket. Lauren, Andy and Bethany all went quiet as Rat lined up his shot. "Ah-woo!" Andy howled, trying to sound like a wolf as he made Rat totally miscue his shot. "No way!" Rat said as he grabbed the white ball off the table. "I'm retaking that." "Cheater," Bethany grinned. "Well, it was out of order," Lauren said. "Oh, there's a shock," Bethany said, before making a smoochy sound. Lauren defends her secret love. "Bite me," Lauren said, as she flicked Bethany off. Rat took the shot for the second time, and the blue rattled in the jaws of the pocket, but didn't drop. "Rightio," Andy said, as he grabbed his cue. 147 break, here I come. Rat sucked a mouthful of orange juice from his carton before moving to stand alongside Lauren. "I'm glad we told everyone," he smiled. Bethany huffed. "Oh yeah, it was such a big secret. We all knew what was going on anyway." Bethany was starting to wind Lauren up. Lauren had put up with several of Bethany's stupid crushes, but now that she had a boyfriend, Bethany was acting all jealous. Bethany's brother Jake and some of his mates were sitting on a sofa waiting for the next game. Jake started singing. "Rat and Lauren sitting in a tree, Bonking." Lauren turned her head sharply and glowered at him. "Unless you want this cue rammed up your ass, I'd suggest that you shut it." "Ooh, tetchy," Jake giggled. "Do you want me to make you cry again, baby brother?" Bethany threatened, suddenly on Lauren's side again. Andy missed an easy red. "Ugh, your shot, Lauren." Lauren knew she was hopeless and decided on a radical strategy. There was an unbroken cluster of red balls in the middle of the table, and she clattered them as hard as she could. "Skill!" Lauren howled, punching the air as a red ball dropped into a pocket. "You are so jammy," Andy tutted. Even better, one of the flying reds had knocked the pink ball into the jaws of a corner pocket. "Come on, baby," Rat grinned as Lauren lined up her next shot. "That's 6 easy points." She smiled as the pink rolled in, but the white ball followed it. "Stupid girl," Jake yelled gleefully. "You should have put some backspin on it." Lauren gave a couldn't-care-less shrug. "I've only played snooker 3 times. I don't understand how to do all that stuff." Lauren was sharing a cue with Bethany, and as she handed it across, the room went oddly quiet. A bunch of lads who were fighting with peperamis, throwing crisps and making lightsaber noises, all settled back into their seats and tried looking innocent. Lauren had to look over her shoulder to find the reason. Zara Asker, Cherub's newly appointed chairwoman, was walking down the spiral staircase that led into the lounge. Zara spotted Lauren and headed straight towards her. "Can we have a private word in my office?" Zara asked. Jake burst out laughing and made a sound like a whip cracking. "Whoosh! You're in trouble," he sang, to the delight of his mates. Zara turned sharply and jammed her finger under Jake's nose. "You're walking on very thin ice, Mr. Parker. I've had several reports about your cheeking lessons, and I can see punishment laps and a few months of washing up duty on your schedule if you don't sharpen up." Jake liked acting cocky in front of his little crew of 10-year-olds, but Zara's glare made him wilt as Bethany poked her tongue at him. "Is it about Mr. Large?" Lauren asked, once they were out of the noisy lounge and heading up the stairs. "No, it isn't," Zara said, as they reached the top and walked out into the fresh air, heading for the main building. "I think it's best if I explain when we get to my office. Although I did have a phone call from Mr. Large's partner earlier. His condition is improving, but it's still serious, and there's a possibility that he'll need a bypass operation. And even if Mr. Large recovers fully, he faces a disciplinary hearing when he comes back to work." "Why's that?" Lauren asked. "I've read all the reports on the Dales incident, and it sounds like Mr. Large had a skinful before his heart attack. The odd pint or two is fine, but he was in charge of 26 children, and drunkenness is unacceptable." "Will he get the boot this time?" Lauren asked, trying to hide a grin. "Probably not," Zara shrugged. "For all his faults, Norman Large is a hard man to replace. It's unbelievably tough to find good training instructors. I mean, would you want to spend your working life running around a muddy assault course and making kids' lives a misery?" Lauren shook her head. "I suppose it takes a certain type of person." "You came out well in Arif's incident report," Zara said brightly. "He says that you had the situation under control when he got back to the camp." "I got the others to pack up the tents and everything," Lauren nodded. "Fortunately, Arif got back from the supermarket just after the vet left, and we managed to clear out before we had police and social services on our backs." "I reckon you're a natural leader," Zara smiled. "I can see you in politics, or running a big company someday." "Politics is boring," Lauren said, smiling back uneasily. "I certainly didn't feel like a leader. The whole thing was pretty chaotic, to be honest. Especially when that old granny started freaking out on me." Zara smiled a little. "Oh, I forgot to tell you. We had to take Meatball to the vet." "Is he okay?" Lauren asked anxiously. "He wasn't eating properly, which is hardly surprising because the vet found 4 of Joshua's Lego bricks lodged in his throat. He's recovering, but I have to keep telling Joshua not to leave toys all over the carpet." "That dog will eat anything," Lauren giggled. "You know you're still welcome to come over and take him for walks anytime you like." Lauren nodded. "I will, but I've had masses of homework. And I've been spending quite a bit of time with Rat." "I see," Zara said, and grinned knowingly. They passed the fountain and went up the steps and into the main building. It was a short walk through reception to Zara's office. The previous chairman, Dr. McCafferty, had lined the room with his collection of books, but Zara had yet to settle in. She'd only found time to put up a few family photos, and the room looked bare. Lauren felt a chill as she spotted James's girlfriend, Kerry Chang, sitting on a chair in front of the desk. She had tears streaking down her cheeks. "James is missing," Kerry sobbed. He might even be dead." Lauren felt like a bomb had gone off inside her skull as her limbs went numb and a great ball welled up in her throat. She grabbed onto a chair to keep herself steady. "Sit down and I'll explain as best I can," Zara said as she guided Lauren into one of the leather chairs. James's mission was in a northern Russian town known as Aero City. The local oligarch is a man called Dennis Oberdin. He owns all of the production facilities, most of the land and housing, and he's even the city mayor. MI5 suspects that Oberdin is selling missiles and other sensitive technology to rogue governments and terrorist groups. But he has powerful friends in Moscow, and the Russian government has consistently turned a blind eye. James was working alongside two MI5 operatives. They aim to set up a deal to buy some missiles and record evidence of every step in the transaction. Faced with such damning evidence, we were hoping to force the Russian government into taking criminal action against Oberdin. James's role in the mission was regarded as low to medium risk, Zara continued. Our biggest problem was infiltrating Oberdin's compound and planting listening devices inside. Our MI5 team found out that Dennis Oberdin was planning to send his only child to a posh English prep school. The boy was having English lessons with a local teacher, but he was struggling. So we flew James out to act as the MI5 agent's nephew, using some kind of background story about James staying with his aunt after his mother had a nervous breakdown. Not long after James arrived, the aunt and uncle casually suggested to Dennis Oberdin that James give his son some informal English lessons. Oberdin took the bait, and James spent a few weeks giving the boy extra English practice after school. At the same time, he learned the layout of the house and began dropping some of our new pinhead-sized listening devices around the place. "So, what went wrong?" Lauren sniffed, as Kerry reached across the desk and gave her a tissue. Zara shrugged. "We're not sure. All we know is that James's aunt and uncle were scheduled to go to Oberdin's house for an important meeting late last night. According to other sources MI5 has within Aero City, a violent row erupted inside the meeting, and Dennis Oberdin was killed. Oberdin's brother, Vladimir, who was also the local chief of police, set off from the compound with 4 other men to capture James and search the apartment where he was sleeping. According to some other Brits who live in the same building, there was a struggle. Several of Oberdin's goons were knocked out, and Vladimir Oberdin was shot in the thigh. "Did James get away?" Lauren asked. "We have absolutely no idea. With Dennis dead, and Vladimir helicoptered to a private hospital in Moscow, other members of the Oberdin family are jockeying for power, and nobody really knows who's in charge or what's going on. There are rumours that James has been captured, but we've also heard that the police are still running a giant manhunt." "But he hasn't communicated," Kerry said, stifling a sob for Lauren's sake. "If he was okay, he surely would have contacted the emergency desk by now." "Did he have a mobile?" Lauren asked. Zara nodded. "He did. And even if he'd lost it, I'm sure there are call boxes and other facilities in the city. We can't be certain, but he's probably been captured by Oberdin's henchmen." "They could be hurting him," Lauren gasped. He might even be dead already." "I'm sorry, sweetheart," Zara said, as she grabbed Lauren out of her chair and pulled her into a hug. "Until we know for sure, you've got to stay calm and try not to think the worst." "Oh, God," Lauren bawled as she squeezed Zara tight. Please don't let him be dead." Zara was crying too, as she rubbed Lauren's back. "James didn't have a mission controller in Aero City because he was being looked after, by the MI5 agents. But Hewitt helped set the mission up. He's already on a flight to Moscow and should be in Aero City by this evening. There are other MI5 officers based in the area, and they're going to liaise with Hewitt and try to locate James. But Lauren wasn't taking anything in. She was sobbing so hard and breathing so fast that she was starting to feel lightheaded. She remembered feeling the same way on the night her mum had died, 3 years earlier. "It might be okay, Lauren," Kerry sniffed. "You know James. He's got a habit of wrangling his way out of things." "But he would have called by now!" Lauren screamed desperately. "Why wouldn't he have called?" Chapter 7. Communication. After escaping from the Brezhnev apartments, James made a stop at one of the city's 24-hour grog shops. These illegal enterprises were mostly run out of shacks or ground-floor apartments and catered to the cravings of the Aero City's addicts, selling cigarettes, alcohol, and glue. He spent the few rubles in his jacket on a stack of chocolate bars, easy to carry and packed with energy to fight off the cold, as well as a box of matches, 4 cans of Coke, and a small bottle of vodka. After that, James set off for the edge of town, with the gun tucked in his jeans, keeping an eye out for a telephone booth as he jogged. But he knew he was unlikely to find one outside of the heavily policed city centre. The lack of telephones was down to a quirk of history. Aero City had been built during the Cold War as a closed city, with all forms of access tightly controlled by the Russian Air Force. Until the 90s, non-residents had to apply for a permit to visit, and foreign citizens were banned. Private telephones were not allowed, and anyone wishing to make a personal call had to spend half a day queuing inside City Hall. Although these restrictions on telephones had been lifted years ago, the city government was desperately short of money, and only a few streets near the centre of Aero City had ever been wired up for telephones. If James wanted to make a call, he'd have to get hold of a mobile. The eastern edge of town had once housed the tens of thousands who worked in the giant production plants, but the young and healthy had long since abandoned Aero City in search of work, while the vulnerable citizens they'd left behind had been moved into blocks nearer the city centre. The result was a ghost town. Dozens of empty blocks, stripped of anything valuable and slowly crumbling back into the earth. James picked one at random and spent the night in a second-floor apartment. Without heat, and with most of the doors and window frames stripped out for firewood, he found refuge in a bathtub with a plastic shower curtain trapping the heat around his body and making a surprisingly effective blanket. He could have started a fire to keep warm, or run back into town and broken into an apartment in the hope of stealing a mobile. But Cherub taught its agents to be patient. The cops would be on high alert, and James didn't understand his surroundings. He decided to hide in the bathtub until he had a clearer head and some daylight to nose around in. James suffered through the night, unable to sleep and wondering what had gone wrong at the meeting. As the wind howled through the missing doors and windows, he sipped the vodka to keep the shivers at bay and clutched his stomach, nursing a dull ache from where he'd been punched in the guts. James was restless and began exploring his bitterly cold surroundings as soon as day broke. He checked out the apartment, stepping gingerly over missing floorboards, then along the balcony where he was relieved to see nothing but more stripped-out apartments. After checking his own floor, James surveyed the rest of the building and concluded that his only companions were the hundreds of pigeons roosting on the top balcony. But when he scanned the neighbourhood from up high, the clothes hanging out to dry and odd wisps of smoke indicated that he wasn't completely alone on the eastern side of Aero City. James had already decided that it would be too risky to try leaving via the only road out of town. There was sure to be a police blockade. He considered escaping through the forest to a neighbouring town and either hitching a lift to Moscow or making a phone call when he got there. The trouble was, the nearest settlement was more than 30 kilometres away. James had no idea where they were, and there was every chance that the Oberdens would have goons on the lookout when he arrived. This left James with one realistic option: sneak back into the city centre, get hold of a mobile phone, and call for help. But with only one set of clothes, he'd be easily identified if he went out in daylight. He'd have to stay inside until it got dark and then sneak into one of the city's more affluent areas and either mug someone or break into an apartment. James didn't have a watch, but he knew it got light at around 8 in the morning and was dark when he came out of school at 4, which left him with 7.5 hours to kill. It was important to stay warm, and now that he felt more confident about his surroundings, he decided to make a fire. Although most of the doors and many window frames had been removed from the block, there was still plenty to burn. James collected up rags and a few sheets of newspaper and used his penknife to strip splinters of wood from a floorboard. He laid them all in the bathroom sink and used a match to light the kindling. He kept the fire small because he didn't want to burn the building down or leave a trail of smoke big enough to be spotted from the ground. But the flames were enough to warm his hands and raise the temperature inside the small bathroom up to a couple of degrees above freezing. Once he'd warmed up, James's thoughts turned to his stomach. The sugar in the chocolate bars and Coke he'd bought the night before would provide him with enough calories to see the day through, but he craved something hot, and his mind turned towards the pigeons roosting on the top floor. He trapped and eaten pigeons during basic training. The meat was tasty and perfectly safe if you gutted the bird and cooked it properly, but he'd also need clean water for making a hot drink and cleaning up. More importantly, James figured that keeping himself busy by boiling water and cooking food would be better for his mental state than spending all day shivering and worrying about whether his future involved an unpleasant reunion with the Aero City police. There were a couple of centimetres of clean snow on the balcony, but he'd need a pot in which to boil and sterilise the water. Fortunately for James, few of Aero City's former residents owned cars, and many had been forced to leave their heaviest and least valuable possessions behind. A tour of a few apartments was all he needed to find a couple of battered pots, an enamel beaker that would serve as a makeshift cup, the wire mesh from a grill tray, and even a plastic office chair to sit on. James built up the fire in the sink and rested the mesh over the top before stepping out onto the balcony. After checking that there was nobody down below, he began scooping fresh snow into the pot until it was almost full. Back inside, he set it down over the flames. His next task was to capture the birds. His mind flashed back to basic training and Mr. Large telling him that pigeons are basically stupid and much easier to catch than fish or mammals. They only have 2 states of mind. The first is, "Oh my God, something's coming, let's fly away." And the second is, "Yeah, everything's fine." If you want to catch a pigeon, all you have to do is make it believe that everything's fine and it will practically walk into the cooking pot. While his pot of snow melted, James raced upstairs to the pigeon-infested 6th floor, clutching his penknife and the large pot. The balcony was encrusted with bird lime and feathers. Naturally, the pigeons flew away when James came near them, but he crouched down with his back to the wall and stayed deadly still. Within seconds, the birds forgot that James existed and began strolling around him as if he wasn't there. When the first one came within a few centimetres of his hand, James reached out and grabbed it before snapping its neck and dumping it in the pot. The sudden movement caused the birds to flutter, but within another minute they were all pecking away at James's feet, and within 10 he had 5 pigeons in his pot. Back downstairs, he found the bathroom smoky but warm, and the snow melting over the flames. He began preparing the pigeons by slitting their throats and letting the blood drain into the bathtub. The first animal James had ever cleaned and cooked had been a freshly shot squirrel during basic training. Pushing his hands inside to pull out the guts and the warm blood sticking to his fingers as he stripped away the pelt had made him feel sick. He'd wondered when such a skill would be useful to an undercover agent in the 21st century, but he appreciated the knowledge now as he expertly skinned and gutted each bird with his penknife before snapping its rib cage to turn each one into a flattened slice that would cook evenly on the small fire. James fed the fire as he worked, and by the time the pigeons were prepared, he had a saucepan of boiling water. Placing the pigeons on the grill, he headed out to the balcony and washed his bloody hands with snow before coming back inside and rubbing them with vodka to sterilize them. After flipping the meat with a stick, James sat on the plastic chair, poured water into the beaker, and took 3 gulps before cupping it under his chin and enjoying the steam rising towards his face. This was his first moment of reasonable comfort since he'd been rudely awakened 8 hours earlier. But it only served to remind James of his precarious situation. He was a long way from home and had never felt more alone in his life.